Welcome to Annotations, an Unruhe Media podcast on art, politics, and life itself. My name is Nico Heller. This episode of Annotations features André Stitt, an artist whose life and work have been profoundly shaped by the Northern Ireland Troubles. The dialogue explores the intersection of materiality, social dynamics, and identity in contemporary human experience, themes central to André's work. We examine how physical structures and the built environment shape personal and communal values and narratives, reflecting on André's investigation of trauma, sectarianism, and the body. Through his deeply personal insights, we consider art as a transformative and redemptive force in the face of political and social upheaval. Born in Belfast in 1958, André's practice initially evolved from painting to performance art as a direct response to civil conflict, before returning to painting as an expanded proposition in 2013. Now professor of performance and interdisciplinary art at Cardiff School of Art and Design, André has also curated numerous international projects, solidifying his position as one of Northern Ireland's most influential artists. I can see that he has arrived, so do let me invite him in. André, I'm glad we've made it. Thank you very much for joining me today for this series of annotations. André, I have already briefly introduced you, so let's dig straight in. Just so that our viewers and listeners know, you're joining me from Cardiff in Wales, isn't that correct?
Not strictly, no. I've just recently moved out of Cardiff, so it's in the Welsh Valleys now where I'm living. It's a place called Merthyr Tydfil. It was actually the heart of the Industrial Revolution and the coal industry. And actually the first steam engine, apparently.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So is this a kind of a withdrawal from sort of the kind of the hustle and bustle of city life in Cardiff, or do you have any kind of other kind of sort of like particular relationship with that part of Wales?
Well, I like it, but no, I had to get out of Cardiff because where I was living was not conducive to good mental health. Too many drug dealers and too many stabbings.
Okay. Well, that doesn't sound too good. When I think of Cardiff or Wales, I think of a kind of a perfect world. I don't really think
No.
of all this bad stuff. Now, Andre, I have already briefly introduced you, so let's dig straight in. Now, what's interesting about this, although you're based in Wales, much of what we're going to be reflecting on today kind of relates to another time in your life as well, and a different part of the world, to Northern Ireland. Now, so let's start there, because of course we will be arriving in Wales, I think, at some point during that dialogue. But let's start a bit earlier. The kind of the societal divisions that have shaped political, social, and cultural discourses in Northern Ireland, well, for a long time, for decades, if not really centuries, are deeply embedded, if not embodied, in the kind of built environment and the architecture of the place. Now, so you have been reflecting and engaging a lot with that. How does physical architecture or physical structure, in your experience, define us? Can you give us some examples from your practice?
Well, I'm not sure about my practice, but roughly speaking, my experience of growing up in Northern Ireland was sort of as a child just before the Troubles, the civil conflict, the ethnic civil conflict in Northern Ireland. So there was and then growing up as a teenager through the Troubles. So the initial period was built on actually a sort of optimism in the 1960s. Which was a kind of calm period in Northern Ireland, but there was also a lot of post-war rebuilding. So a lot of families got moved out of Belfast. So it sort of slightly deregulated the sectarianism between communities and tried to mix them in new towns or new housing estates, that is new social housing. So that seemed to be, I retained that sense of optimism that came with that. And then latterly, when we moved into the Troubles, the construction of Belfast itself changed. So there were fortifications within the city centre, and as the British Army came in, then there were fortresses and kind of brutalist structures, which kind of had a very strange relationship to actually the living conditions we had, because it was post-war brutalist architecture. So you weren't quite sure what was what in terms of conflicting architecture. But what that meant in terms of my work, say, as a performance artist, was that I started using these spaces. Um, uh, some of them could be abandoned buildings, houses, and make performances within those constructions. Latterly, as my practice progressed, and so I was making performances in institutions like large galleries, for instance, I would then make installations which would have a kind of relationship to those constructions. So you would have to kind of move through, say, walls and different territories within a gallery space, but then you would be met by me doing something within that space. So I mean, some of the places that I would use, as I said, might be within Belfast, would be those sorts of buildings. But as I travelled internationally, it meant that I was placed within other situations like military hospitals. I made or military bases, for instance. I remember making several for performances in places like that. So you know, it kind of shifted and moved. You know, the sorts of areas that I was moving in, from art institutions to site specific work. To
Absolutely.
make.
Can I just interject there for a second? I mean, to me, and I spent, and I'm not sure whether you're aware of this. In fact, we had the same teacher. I did a master's in fine art as well in Belfast many years later than you. And I also studied with Alistair, of course, and Alistair McLennan. So I know Belfast a little bit myself. And there's two aspects to the sort of the physical physicality of Belfast I would like to kind of explore a little bit more. One is the materiality of it, you know, the concrete specifically. There's the peace lines, and then there's this kind of blast barriers, that would kind of protect police stations and other installations. You already mentioned them. So there's something quite material about these materials. And then there is the geography, which is also really quite interesting. I mean, one thing I always thought was quite interesting is that when you would go to the Crown Bar, which is a bar at in the center of town, and people would frequent that place in those days. I'm not sure whether you're Lavery, so other places like that. What you would get is people would come in from those outlying kind of suburbs, which would be segregated, but within the city center, it would be a kind of a peace zone in some ways, and in many times, like on a Friday night, it would turn into a free for all, and people would mix, but then they would withdraw into their kind of segregated communities. I thought that was a very, very interesting kind of like a lung breathing in and out, and there was something quite interesting about both of those movements. So I think that's what's interesting about the geography. There's another thing. I used to live for a while up on the Springfield Road, which was between Springmartin and Ballymurphy, separated by a peace wall. And the actual place was right next on a peace line, and right next to it was a kind of an opening where both sides would use to kind of get to the other side. All the houses nearby were petrol bombed. They were all kind of burned out because both sides wanted to be able to cross over without being seen. And so it was a kind of a really rather kind of exposed place to live. And there was more than once that I had to have buckets of water, by the window, because there was a possibility that they would throw petrol bombs. And indeed, they did once or twice. So these are kind of really interesting. And I'm sure, as a sort of a Belfast lad, you have experienced a lot more of this. And so I'd like to go a little bit more into that when we talk about how space and materiality shapes, our awareness.
Well, I mean, that's interesting because, of course, it depends what sort of time period you're talking about. And if I think about the 1970s, for instance, when I was a teenager, actually the centre of Belfast was completely dead. You didn't go there. And actually, right, maybe into the mid 80s is a little bit like that as well. So there's a period where, during the day, there would be a lot of commercial activity and people shopping, for instance. But of course, there were there were barriers to that as well because you were searched going into because the whole city centre was ringed, a bit like a Berlin Wall, but not not on that scale, something like that, where you had to kind of go through, and then you were searched. And then you were searched in every shop as well. So it was very difficult to actually negotiate the territory. And of course, if you were young like me, you were constantly stopped by the British Army as well, who were on foot patrol. So you were always up against the wall, just trying to do your ordinary stuff. And you were stopped doing what you wanted to get from one side of the city to the other, just to go to the art school, for instance. You were up against the wall and you were searched, and you had some kind of like actually the equivalent teenager with a gun pointed to your head who was a British Army young, squatty, So that was a kind of very interesting thing where you saw kind of British soldiers who were your age, and yet they were pointing a rifle at your head, and I used to be freaked out, but I was going to go off because if anything happened, my fear was like, oh, he'll just go like that and shoot my bloody head off. So there was a kind of the human kind of negotiation of that, but also the way that it was an ad hoc series of architectural interventions made it increasingly difficult to kind of move from one place to another. But of course, then you got to know how you negotiated that, and that's always interested me. I think when I moved to London and I was living in squats, which were like big old blocks of flats in London, which were surrounded by social housing. Then there was this sense of there was something about how it was designed to probably initially to allow access and freedom of movement, but increasingly because things have been added to it, it seemed there were barriers in the way of getting from A to B. So like, it was almost like Belfast was kind of somehow superimposed on London in certain areas as well. So I always had like a kind of suspicion that the government was using Northern Ireland or Belfast as some kind of testing area and then kind of locating it to London in some way, which in fact they were, in places like Brixton, for instance, in South London. So, that was kind of interesting.
It's interesting. I mean, just to answer the kind of the time period when I was there, it was between 1988 and 1993, like
Oh,
5 year
okay.
period.
Yeah.
So it was, as you said, it was later, and it was actually already, it was before the Good Friday Agreement, but there was already a kind of a more life in the city center. Now, another thing that I obviously encountered quite frequently were people that either had left to move to London, or people who had been in London for a while and had moved back to Belfast or Northern Ireland because they couldn't stand it, or because they'd fallen on hard times. There was many reasons why people would move back, and so there was a kind of a thing between going to London and going back to Belfast. How was that for you when you went to the big smoke? Was that kind of like kind of your kind of claim to fame, or was it a kind of a getting away from Belfast?
I had to leave. It was as simple as that. I mean, myself and my partner at that time, Tara Babel, who I was making performance with, we had to leave. We were threatened and we had to leave. And in fact, we saw ourselves as refugees. And, if you look at, the notion of what constitutes a refugee, that forced sense of like, you were leaving because of economic for a start. You couldn't make a living there, but also because of the conflict, we were threatened because of who we were and what we were doing. And so there was persecution, and we had to get out, and it was very difficult to kind of come backwards and forwards for a little time. And in fact, there was a long period why I didn't go back. I mean, it's interesting you talk about this toing and froing. It got a little bit easier for me in the 90s and certainly after the Good Friday Agreement. But I think that it's been problematic in that, for instance, at some point recently I thought of going back to live permanently, and then I realized that I couldn't do it. I was so separated. It's really kind of ambivalent in a way, it's like there's an umbilical cord. Like I'm totally attached to the place. I've got a history there. And yet when I walk around the streets, I'm filled with dread. And yet, I mean, I had a situation where actually a German friend of mine met me in Belfast. We were over for some conference, and she wanted to go and get a black taxi tour. Now, these are tours that take you around conflict areas, and it was going up the Falls Road. It was going into Republican areas. I'm a Protestant, right? So this is like way after the Good Friday Agreement. Everything's supposed to be normal and great, right? And she's sitting and the guy's talking in the car, in the taxi, and telling her about stuff. And I'm thinking, oh, this is a crock of shit. And, you know, but I can't say anything because I'm Protestant. I do not want to get into the dialogue of where are you from?
Oh, no,
You know,
absolutely. I mean, and of course,
but she kept looking at me and she was going like, what's wrong with Andre? Because usually you can't shut him up, right? And I kept quiet. The guy thought I was German, right? Because I wasn't saying anything. And so my friend Heike was at the end. She's like, what was going on there? She says, I can't say anything. You
oh,
know?
absolutely. Hold on 1 second, please.
I hope he's going to get something interesting. Maybe he's going to show us some pictures, maybe some photographs of when he was there in Belfast, when he was a bit younger and a bit better good looking. Maybe it's the mailman, maybe it's Amazon's calling.
Okay, so this has never happened to me before. I forgot to plug in my laptop and the battery was running low. That's why I had to just go and get a sort of a lead to connect it.
It's okay. We've had a really nice discussion about you while you're away.
Interesting. I look forward to hearing that. Now, one theme, and we'll be coming back to this throughout this dialogue, is this notion of home. And because I think that is quite, I mean, you mentioned this sort of sense of exile and sort of being driven out of your home. So in a sense, it's got a context to it. But at this point, I'd like to talk about it within the context of structure. You know, what I mean, when you think about, you know, the difficulty of getting around in Belfast at the time and everything that the structure put in your way, did that become part of your sense of home? And how did that kind of in a way help you articulate what home meant to you?
Well, yeah, these are kind of, again, I come back to ambivalence about this because there are two sides that coexist in this. The difficulty is talking about what home means. So you have the house, and then you have what's in the house, and you have the street outside, and you have the community. And during the Troubles, the fragmentation of that community, but also the communal within the family structure. So that was quite difficult, and because of what had been happening within my family, and then what had happened as a result of the Troubles, you have these two kind of conflicted notions of trauma, quite complex how they're interwoven. So, and you know, this took years to kind of untangle for me, you know, what was going on. So home initially meant some form of security, but then it became very insecure because of what was happening in the home. And then it became more insecure because of what was happening outside the home. However, those structures outside were much more interesting. And actually, I think this had a lot to do with creating a kind of drama out of it and much more exciting. Because you know, really scary and terrifying, but somehow adrenalized, you know, so it created a drama. So that notion of obstacle or negotiation, I found really exciting and really interesting. It was like a big adventure, you know, a scary adventure, but, you know, a kind of adventure that took me out of the domestic situation to somewhere else where I felt more alive.
I mean, it's interesting, you know, because I mean, and it's a very difficult thing to really to articulate without sounding sort of sensationalist or in some ways sort of overly dramatic. But I mean, I found, and I think a lot of people who go to Northern Ireland to study art or just to go for whatever reason, and of course, people there as well. I mean, I think people like Alistair MacLennan, I think he felt quite energized in an interesting kind of way by that context. You know, and his work was also heavily influenced and shaped by, you know, by the Troubles and by the whole sort of the social drama and the whole political drama that evolved around that. So it is quite an interesting thing, and it's hard to talk about it without sounding exploitative. You know, there's a, you know, in a way. And I remember there was a kind of in in Belfast, there was quite an interesting discussion about what it means to be a political artist, for example. I mean, I don't, without mentioning names, but is it enough to kind of put a helicopter in your painting to make it a political statement, or what exactly, how exactly do you engage with that in a kind of a, in a sort of in an interesting way? What's your kind of thinking on that? How did you kind of deal with that problem of kind of using something that is really quite painful for most people, if not all, and to make that into art? What was the sort of the thinking there for you?
Well, it's like anything. If you're an artist from outside of that situation, you can leave it. And so you can kind of, come into it, make your statement, and then walk away from it. So you're not living with it.
Right.
And you often get this notion of, well, why aren't you making more political work? Well, because you can't. There's enough political work going on around you. So what happened would be that it was codified. Things were codified. It might be color within something. Or, I mean, for instance, I recognized at some point in my first year at art school that there was a lot of a certain kind of painting going on. And no one was really saying what it was. It was like, it was abstract. It wasn't figurative. But there was lots of kind of conflicting things going on. Where there were lots of sharp. I can notice lots of angular things going on, lots of sharpness, or things butting against something else. And I think that's how it got codified within the work. So if anything, that was more political because you were dealing with the trauma of what was going on. Latterly, it's interesting that, as I passed into stages through that art school, then there became this kind of school of figuration where it became almost like a caricature. That was how people dealt with it. So again, it was codified through this kind of caricature of certain stereotypes of Northern Ireland people within certain stereotypical situations that looked stereotypically like the Troubles, So that's how people dealt with it. I mean, I would say that I dealt with it it was codified within it. It was like, it was what you wore, how you wore it, what you did in your kind of daily activity. So that was performative. If I was walking about Belfast dressed in paramilitary gear, that was certainly provocative and performative, and that would get me into trouble. But
Absolutely.
that's what I was looking for. I was looking for that edge of conflict, because I was so angry that's what I needed. But that anger was not only about what was going on; it was about, as I say, coming back to being energized or adrenalized. It was something to do with the trauma that had happened before that when I was a child, and that carrying through.
I mean, it's such a complex scenario that you're describing here. It's just that simple act of walking through Belfast sort of in paramilitary gear. I mean, just kind of frame that a little bit for our listeners. I mean, it's very different whether you do this as a Protestant or a Catholic, because obviously the politics and the kind of the polarization is quite extreme, and the narratives are also quite established. So I think there's an issue, not an issue, but there is something around perspective and positionality there, which kind of, I would say, makes it much harder for a Protestant to do that, possibly in those days, than for a Catholic. Because of course the Catholics were freedom fighters, and they had this kind of way of, in a way, sort of like mythologizing them. So, I mean, if you look at the murals, I mean, if anywhere in Belfast, you'd instantly know whether you're in a Protestant or Catholic area, because the paintings on the walls, the murals, they would be very, very distinct and very, very different. Like, sort of, Catholics would kind of, in a way, latch on to any kind of resistance movement in the world, from the ANC and the apartheid struggle in South Africa, you name it. Protestants had it much harder to kind of, in a way, develop their kind of visual and their kind of narrative identity, because they were sort of seen as the colonizers and the oppressors. And in comes André Stitt, who is taking a very independent position here, but obviously must get caught in the crossfire between those narratives. How did you deal with that, as a Protestant who wasn't going to take that Protestant narrative for granted?
Huh. Well, as you say, it was not about. I mean, I can see what you're saying, but it wasn't about taking one side over the other. It was something about trying to uh, it's sort of observational, but trying to comment on something in between. It's almost, I think it's something like this vibration between the two, where the identification gets mixed up, and it vibrates between the two. It vibrates between, say, victim and perpetrator, and whatever that might be. It kind of crosses like that, So it's constantly shifting, and many ordinary people, Catholic or Protestant, wouldn't have been dressing like that at all. I mean, would kind of dress down so that they wouldn't be noticed, except on certain days when there was a celebration of one or the other, right? So my position was to throw something into, say, a quotidian experience, a daily experience that made someone just sort of, what's that? Why is that there? What's going on in the street? That doesn't look like either a paramilitary or the British Army, because it didn't. It was a mixture of these things, and there would be things on whatever I was wearing that would be kind of just slightly not right. And that's what I wanted to question, that it wasn't a precise uniform that was being worn. And yet people would see what they wanted to see in it as well. And so the
Well,
British would stop me
and they must have, because you wouldn't have been a threat, or you wouldn't have been perceived as a threat by by certain sections of the community who eventually presumably wanted you to leave, which you said is what you did eventually when you went to London. So you must have stepped onto somebody's toes along the way.
Yeah, but that's a little bit more complicated. It wasn't as black and white as one would perceive. For instance, um, this would also be about um, nonconformist identity, or what's perceived as something outside of the norm. So you have your artist doing something, right? But as an artist, you could get away with that because that was weird, right? And that's how I dealt with stuff since I was a kid, just being slightly weird, so that I could get away with stuff and not be touched, right? Which didn't always work, but um, there are also lots of other issues about what one was doing and how one was perceived, which had nothing to do with the troubles, but had everything to do with controlling the community. And that's a big part of what people often don't talk about how communities were being controlled by paramilitaries or governmental forces, to conform to something, you know. I'm quite sure, and I don't know whether I should be saying this, but I have a feeling that the British government, if the Protestants stayed in that area and the Catholics stayed in that area and they didn't bother anybody, that would have been fine, and you could kind of control all that. But it didn't. It was messy. That was the problem. It was messy, and that messiness really intrigued me. That things weren't as they appeared. So the 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 reasons for leaving are quite complex. I mean, I could say economically, because there was no way that I could continue making the work I was making in Northern Ireland. Also creatively, it was a dead end. It really was at that point. There was nowhere to go with that. But it also was in the nature of identity, because of what had happened to me earlier in my teenage years. I'm getting involved in situations that I should not have been involved in, and how I extricated myself from those situations. That also caused resentment from certain parts of my own community. So there were like lots of various layers to this about why one had to leave. And really, if you wanted to be an artist, and actually, you know what? I was always going to leave anyway. I wanted to see the world. It's like, why, you know. But Northern Ireland it's very parochial, and people know what's going on, and they know each other's business. And the notions that somehow there was kind of, things were secret. Well, no, people knew what was going on. It's just that you didn't talk about it.
Well, let's talk about a little bit about this statement. You always wanted to leave Northern Ireland. I mean, nomadism and obviously exile in some ways related to that, I would imagine, were kind of quite central themes. It's something that you kind of, seems to inform some of the work you've done. Can you talk a little bit about those, and also, of course, maybe some of the reasons that relate to that?
To relate to what? To
Well,
leaving?
to this to your kind of interest in nomadism.
Oh, right. Yeah. Well, yeah. Simple fact, my mother's French. And so, I had this sense that there was a bigger world outside. Actually, in a way that a lot of people I grew up didn't have this sense of going out into the world. They were quite happy to be within a kind of smaller community and the security of that. I was never interested in that. And the fact that I was interested in art from a very early age, what you have to remember is what I was interested from a very early age was completely outside of the sphere of most of my peers. They did not understand art. They found it too strange, too difficult. They were intimidated by it because of the questions that it raised about our perception of reality, for a start. And so my almost like my autodidactic education of art that I had from an early age equipped me with this understanding that the world was a much bigger place, and I wanted to go out and experience that, and I wanted to make art in all sorts of places. Now that was also informed by you know by my mother being French, by growing up with the knowledge of Picasso, but also really, really importantly, pop art in the 1960s. Now, when I started talking about pop art in the 1960s, and my art teacher, he didn't know what I was talking about. And I had to go and get this book that someone had given me. And the thing is that I was influenced by certain people around me who did go out of Northern Ireland and came back and then fed me the information. I'm talking about as a child. I'm not talking about even as a teenager. I had that knowledge. And so I wanted to go to, like, wow, Andy Warhol, I'm going to New York. Wow. And also crucially, when I was a teenager, David Bowie, yeah, that's where I want to go. I want to do that. And then
I
you
mean,
get,
it's interesting, Andre. I mean, nomadism, of course, the nomad is quite is if you like if you like the opposite, or the of the settled person. Yeah, you've got the settler and you've got the nomad, and the settler plows the land and so on and so forth, and the nomad is in a way kind of transitory. In motion, and they have very different concepts of being and of existing, and of course, nomadism to some extent, presupposes the possibility to move around, so which, and I would like to relate that back to the kind of your experience of Northern Ireland. I don't want to labor it too much, but there is something interesting about, on the one hand, the sort of the history of Northern Ireland, which is the history of colonial settlers settling in Northern Ireland and making it their home, and of course all the conflicts and everything that is kind of springing from that. To the point where within communities, there's this fault lines, and moving around gets more difficult because of the peace walls and the segregation, the bigotry, and so on. So you've got a really interesting kind of settler story here, and where that led in Northern Ireland, and how the communities are dealing with that to kind of come to terms and to solve it. On the other hand, nomadism has been a very attractive proposition to you. So I don't know. Can you talk about those two
yeah.
concepts in parallel, to sort of see whether there's anything that one informs the other?
Well, I mean, in truth, I was a nomad in my own home. And so, the conflict within my own home meant that I kind of detached myself from it. So from an early age, I was kind of moving out of the family home quite a bit and being kind of nomadic within my own community and going off. So I always had that wandering, um, kind of it's almost a state of mind, going, and it's about being inquisitive as well. I was always been incredibly inquisitive about why is that there? Why is that person acting like that? What's going on here? What's the context of that thing here? And I would go out and I find out, and I'd go and talk to people, adults, I'd wander off, I mean, and nowadays you wouldn't let your kid out to do stuff like that, but I would just wander off. It was a really different kind of the way the families were set up and at that time were very, very different. But so the nomadism was always there, and that also that inquisitive about the world was always there. I really wanted to know, and that's exciting to me, and it remains exciting to me. Um, that I think the other part that you're talking about, what was it about going away from Northern Ireland? Was that it? I can't
Well,
remember.
no, not so much the going away, more the sort of the desire to, sort of almost like sort of a counter thing to the sort of the kind of the quite rigid structures in Northern Ireland.
Well, yeah,
Um,
okay. So, yeah, the rigid structures, and I knew that from an early age. There was something not quite right there, and I really wasn't interested in all the religious, because all that tension was just under the surface, even in the 1960s. I knew that, and when it changed into the troubles after the civil rights, because I identified with the civil rights at an early age. We talked about that in the house and stuff. So that kind of notion of you know going further afield. I could have been anywhere, Nico. It wouldn't have mattered. I kind of whatever it is genetically within me, it would have been like I want to go and see what's over there. I want to know what that the experience of that place is. Now I think that what contributed to that in my teenage years and then through art school and then leaving would be the whole notion of trauma and conflict and actually empathizing or identifying with other places. And that has to do with colonization, absolutely, So the things I was reading about would be about other colonized situations, say North America with the genocide of First Nations, et cetera, et cetera. So there were lots of things I was reading about, but identifying with in a kind of much more global idea of where I was coming from. So it was never really just local. It was kind of going out and being global. I wanted to know other people's experiences.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I find it in my own life quite interesting how the sort of preoccupations and these kind of dispositions kind of feed into practice. And you're now a professor of performance and interdisciplinary art. And there's something about interdisciplinarity which is quite nomadic in my kind of sense of understanding of the word. Can you talk a little bit about how the sort of the nomadic aspect in your, if you like, in your life has fed into your artistic practice, and maybe talk a little bit about you understand what you mean by interdisciplinarity and all the rest.
Yeah, I think it's beyond. It's not really interdisciplinarity. I think it's transdisciplinarity. It kind of it translates across. And also, from a very early age, I knew that art making didn't have to be about one thing, which for most people is painting. When you say, oh, what sort of painting do you make then? I mean, I am painting now. I always have painted, so painting was initial. However, that transdisciplinarity came out of the 1960s when there was an eruption of experimentation. And thankfully, as I said, I had access to understanding some of that. I remember a very, very young seeing a film on television of an action painter, and I have a feeling that it might have been. I remember the guy was Japanese, so it might have been one of the good Thai artists, and he was flinging paint and he was rolling around in it. It could have been Kazu Shiraga or someone like that. And I remember thinking, wow, it's like it's got to do with the body, and it's about something beyond just me being kind of separated from the image or the object. It can be an embodied experience. Now, I didn't have the language for this, but I understood intuitively there was something more to it than that. So that kind of transdisciplinarity opened up as a kid, that you could make art in any way you wanted. So I was making sculpture and I was mixing things together. I was making assemblages in the shed, all that kind of stuff, and it was basically untutored, and it just intuitive. And I don't know where that came from. I have no idea. But I just knew intuitively that you could mix it up and do whatever you wanted. And I still feel like that. that notion that somehow, you have to have your signature style. And that's great but that's about the capitalism of the gallery space, of the commercial art world. I'm not particularly interested in that. To me, that's another form of control. Now, that's not to say that I don't work with galleries, because of course I do. But it's interesting that the notion of oh well, we want a certain kind of painting from you, and suddenly I'm not delivering that. It's like the worst thing to say to me. It's like, well, I'm not going to do that then. I'm not going to do what you say. So there was always that rebellion of like, well, you want to make art like that? No, I'm going to try this and I'm going to mix it up. So when I started making performance, I had not even heard of the term. I had not met Alistair McClellan. I was on a undergraduate art course, which is kind of called a foundation course in art, where you do lots of different things, which was great, because there you had your disciplines, only they weren't kind of crossing them necessarily. But then I was getting all this, technical proficiency in different things, and then mixing it up. So when I was doing the foundation course in art and design, I started making these actions. I just thought, oh, action, it's like an action. That's what you do. This can be art. And then out of that, I discovered performance art. And then that just kind of like opened the whole thing for me.
And that actually stayed with you. This was some kind of spiritual home for you within your practice, as I understand it. And in fact, you have described it really as a methodology for survival. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit, because you have been going in many directions, but you do tend to come back to performance as something, as sort of a redemptive or sort of a healing force within your own practice. Can you talk a little bit about that, and when that started, and how that kind of has developed over time?
Well, if you think about the notion of the body, and then I equated that with, okay, you've got the singular body, but what I want is the communal. So the notion of making an action means that you are creating some kind of relationship with the environment around you, but the environment inevitably may be inhabited by other human beings. So you have to have some relationship to that. Something's going to happen. There's going to be some sort of exchange in that, some meeting that's going to take place. So that's what I was interested in. And out of that comes the dialogue then, So that then, I started meeting other artists. And that was a revelation to me as well, because when I started making performance, when I went to the art school, then I discovered nail art, postal art, and I started corresponding with artists around the world. So you're talking about pre-social media by decades. You're talking about artists writing letters to each other, artists making photocopy or collages, sending them to each other, making booklets, distributing information, making manifestos, creating positions, So that was the community that I started to have. And then when I was a student, I started going backwards and forwards to London because I was a punk. I go to punk clubs, see punk bands. That was part of the community as well. So there were all these communities which somehow coalesced when I moved to London and started living in the squatting scene, which was full of nomads, just itinerant people moving in and out. But then we would create events. This was our community. And it was kind of like, here's the alternative. Here's another way of living, which is out of dominant social structure. We can do something else with this. Now, I'm not saying that it worked particularly well, because it did attract people from different backgrounds who maybe were slightly dysfunctional in some way. But it did create a community, and so that's what interested me, that community, how you come together. And I think, you're talking about something, you said something spiritual. I did find it profoundly spiritual, that connection to other people through making the performance, creating events, and then having, contacting people in other cities or other countries, and maybe starting to go and visit them, and then the exchange happening.
Well, what I'm sort of trying to get to is this notion of survival.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, you could, let me just to
okay.
paraphrase it, you could also, instead of calling it as a methodology for survival, you could turn this round and you could call it a methodology for happiness or for, you know, for success or whatever. But no, you're looking at you're kind of guarding against the sort of, you know,
Okay, I'm being disingenuous towards maybe some of the people within that squatting culture because it was difficult at times and quite dysfunctional. However, it would coalesce and come together in events, or you would learn about how to live with people intergenerationally as well. This wasn't all young people, there were a bunch of hippies in this or whatever, anarchists, whatever, there's all sorts of people, Hells Angels, God knows what was going on. But somehow you were accepted within this situation. And there was a kind of, I'm not going to say there was an equality, but there was a sort of equality somehow in acceptance within that situation. So I think that people were drawn to it to survive because they couldn't survive within the dominant capitalist economies that existed at that time and still exist. That don't really leave room for to breathe. They don't leave room really for much creativity because it's controlled creativity. And so there's a lot of creativity in that situation.
but I
So
mean, you started off doing performance long before you went to London. And in the Belfast context, survival, I don't mean life or death. I mean a sort of an emotional survival as much as
yeah,
anything. So I'm not taking it to this kind of, level, but even at the sort of emotional and spiritual and sort of mental level, intellectual level as well. I mean, you name it. At all these different levels, aesthetic level, it was for you, it became a methodology for survival. Maybe start talking about that a little bit within the Belfast, because my sense is that by the time you got to London, you already had your methodology, which probably helped you also then to survive within a different set of difficult circumstances. But to understand really how performance, I mean, I'm thinking, I mean, you've done some really quite, epic work around the Schenkel Butchers, which clearly, I mean, was, a very, very cathartic work. And so sort of like survival within that context has a great many connotations.
yeah, yeah. The difficulty is I might have been the only one making that kind of work. Um, and I, on the one hand, it was coming from a, a place of trying to understand what, for instance, the Shankill Butcher Gang were about and how I identified as a Protestant male with that kind of psychology. And given circumstances, was I capable of that? That's what fascinated me. At the same time, of course, I found it thoroughly repugnant, difficult to deal with. But it was also lots of people weren't really willing to talk about it. And so I chose to talk about it through making the work. Now, that's one example. Um, the community, because you're going to an art school, the community, it meant that the community was diverse and it was mixed. And so that's what was good about that, where you could make that kind of work and actually be supported, even though people found it difficult to deal with. They didn't say, I don't remember any major arguments about it. Actually, arguments came much later with people who weren't actually anything to do with that situation. But there was within Belfast, because we were art students together, we were sharing houses and actually, at one point we acquired outside Belfast, we acquired this massive house. It was like a mansion, right? And it meant that we were living in this mansion and we all had studios because there were all these rooms in it. And we also had two bands, my own band and another band who were playing music. So we rehearsed in this space and then we go out and do gigs. So there was also a connection to that punk scene within Belfast that brought a lot of the community, young people from communities together. So we go and play gigs and people would come to this house and hang out at this house. And we do all the usual stuff, take drugs, drink, etc., have sex, whatever it was, and have parties, So that was part of the community, and that's what kind of, in a way, um, that was a method for survival. That you came this island,
Let me rephrase this, because I'm still not entirely clear. What you're saying. So, I mean, I think most artists would, in a way, use their art to work stuff out. So that's what we do, at many levels. But there's a difference between, art and art therapy. There's a difference between, and this is the thing, this is, I think, the difference I'd like you to kind of to make very clear between, performance as a method or methodology of survival and performance as therapy. Do you know what I'm saying? So when you say a method for survival, does that mean that it was therapy, or does it mean something else?
It probably means a bit of everything.
But would you draw?
It was therapeutic without us understanding or even calling it that. We would never have used language like that. But it was therapeutic. But as you said, and rightly so, it wasn't art therapy. Because we were making aesthetic judgments about things. We were testing things. We were experimenting with ways of making art. So as a methodology for survival, it's as simple as being able to have the freedom to have creativity in a situation which really wouldn't allow that to happen. It wanted to control you.
It's very interesting. There's one other aspect, artists very rarely talk about, because in a way, some would say they shouldn't have to concern themselves with that. And that's the audience. Is in your mind, performance is a method of survival, only a method of survival for you as a performer, or would you put that forward as a proposition to the audience as well?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, and I don't think there's any. My experience is that it's different in different circumstances. And I don't mean to be vague about that. I'm really not trying to be vague, but I don't think you can tie it down because each context creates a different situation. And sometimes it may have brought the audience together, and sometimes it may have alienated them. However, I always felt that there was a ripple effect, where even if it alienated people, it would kind of ripple out and they might talk to someone about it. The dialogue might start and something else might. And in fact, people have talked to me about that. On many, many occasions, actually, I saw you do this thing, 20 years ago, and I really hated it and it really upset me. And, last week this happened to me and I got it. It's about something happening within someone's life that then they can get that identification. It may not happen immediately, but sometimes it does. And it might be just partial. It might happen for some people in an audience or maybe not. So it's about context and also about lived experience, because everyone's in a different position within their spiritual, intellectual, emotional growth, physical growth. So it depends where you're at and if you're susceptible or open to it. In the same way that that's happened to me with other artists' work, artists that I've completely disregarded, and then 30 years later, realizing what had taken place and think, oh my God, I didn't get that. That's incredible what they just did there. So it's being open.
Absolutely. I mean, there's one aspect about performance art, certainly the way it's practiced in Northern Ireland, and I would say in many places, is that performance artists take their work to their audience. They perform in the street. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of this dialogue that you would dress up, as a kind of in a paramilitary uniform, or kind of an imagined paramilitary uniform. And you would walk the streets, and of course you would encounter people, and they would encounter you. And this would be a kind of an accidental audience, or it would be you wouldn't seek them out, and it would be quite a different audience from the kind of the filtered audience that you might get in a gallery setting, or a museum, or a theater. So there is clearly, you have for taking your art to the people, into the community. You already kind of articulate a relationship that you wish to have with your audience, with your community, and then filter the direct relationship and suspecting relationship. Can you talk a little bit about that as a performance artist? And you mentioned other contexts like a squat in London, where you might do a performance. Again, this is not a kind of a filtered audience. This is just your context where you live. Can you talk a little about that and why that was your audience?
What, particularly in Belfast?
Well, other people.
Well, the thing about this, Nico, is it's like I've done it all over the world, and that always places me in some relationship to whoever is present. And as you say, sometimes these are organized events where people come to them and they know that there's some kind of event happening, some sort of performance in public, they know that's happening. Or it could be transitory where I'm moving through a space and you're just encountering people as you go along. I mean, I made a performance in 2000 in Belfast, and I crawled across the streets of Belfast from my old neighborhood to a bar, a pub where my father drank, and my father had just died, and it was a kind of pilgrimage of sorts. But also, it was 2000, and there were still negotiations going on in relation to the Good Friday Agreement. This was it was slightly more drawn out than 1998. So things were still going on. And I was going through Belfast, but I was covered in tar and feathers. Now, that is a punishment by paramilitaries, right? So people got the symbolism of it, but I would stop, and some people were disgusted by it, and some people were helping me. And that's that just changes. The audience just changes that much, But, there would be this dialogue that would go on throughout. So whereas there would be, I did it over a number of years in the 2000s, from about 2000 to about 2008. I did a lot of performances around the world where I was invited to do something on the streets, and I simply walked through the streets with a large sign that said "I love you," right? And I would meet people and I'd tell them how much I loved them. And we'd have this dialogue and we'd have this discussion about, and sometimes it would be like, "Oh, I love you." And, "Oh, I love you too." Because they're caught unawares by it, and then I would give them a little badge and it'd be, "I love you." So they would carry on the performance, But that performance was uniformly wonderful everywhere I went, Did it all over, the British Isles, Ireland, did it in New York, did it in the Venice Biennale. It was like everywhere I did it, people felt uniformly good about it. Now, there was a lot of preparation in that performance, emotionally, to get to that point, because sometimes I wasn't having a good day. So I had to meditate a lot and think about this. This is for the people that I'm meeting. It's not about me. It's about the love that exists between us in that moment. And I had to really work, and that took several years to kind of work through to get to that point to make that performance. So, that was the dialogue and that was the audience. So, there are many things like that just change in that meeting between people.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, there are also kind of filtered situations where you would have a gallery audience or museum audience. And then, of course, the kind of the engagement would be quite different, because you'd have a more, an audience that is less innocent in some ways, or more sort of expecting a performance.
But, that's interesting for me because I always saw them as the enemy. That's unfair, but it was sort of a bit like that. That sense of making a theater performance or a gallery performance, which were really quite structured in a way, but then they created the structure, and then all hell could happen within the structure once it started, and it was always like me against them in some way, so it's like, how far am I going to push this? How many taboos am I going to break in this performance? I'm setting it up, and you've come to see me set something up. This is what I'm fascinated by, and you've willingly come in here knowing what might happen here. And then you're walking out complaining about it when you knew. And it's kind of that tension between the art audience and me, you know. Yeah.
Absolutely. Andre, you said previously that art, or you rather said work, is love made visible. And I think you didn't say art, you said work, but presumably you could use that interchangeably. And I think what you are saying is as much the act of doing it as as the sort of the result, the work of art itself. Can you elaborate a little bit what you mean by, work or art is love made visible? Because I think it's interesting within the context of your performance work, because it doesn't always has love written all over it. I mean, it has in some cases, as you just explained, but there were other pieces where they were much more cathartic and where it's quite hard to think that this is actually, that this is love made visible. Can you talk a little bit about where that notion comes in?
Hmm. I have often made work from the position of anger, but trying to set up a situation where that anger could be resolved in some way. So it might start from me, but it then would be about a set of circumstances that anger has to do with. Maybe it's just an issue, maybe it's several things bound up together. And I'm trying to find some way of reconciling or resolving that. So I'm looking for maybe empathy, understanding. Yeah, certainly some form of catharsis might need to happen. But what I'm trying to do is to find love in that situation, you know. And that might start with love for myself and the person who was damaged within me. And by extension, trying to move outward to seeing if there's a response in an audience. And maybe there's a few people there who are responding, because I become very acutely aware in the moment that something's happening, that there's something going on. There's a feeling, you know, and there might be a few people who respond to that. Work as love made visible comes more from, I think, a studio practice. I mean, I think that, you know, there's always that sense of it has to come from a place, although there's anger involved, there has to be that place of love and compassion. That's where it starts from. However, in a studio practice, because I've also made this transition several years ago where I've started really concentrating on painting and installation work. And that means it's about making things. It's very physical. It's about construction, constructing things. It's also about something to do with the body, fluid. And there's a fluidity about it as well, metaphorically. And so when I go to the studio, there has to be, or I work up to that position of being in the moment, and at the center is love. You know, the feeling of whatever that is, love is at that moment. And through making it becomes visible.
I mean, I want to kind of go a bit deeper here, because I think what one kind of one thing that, you know, we've sort of like, you know, like in our sort of preliminary communication sort of talked about is this relationship of trauma and the way this kind of like has a shaping, or has shaped both your performance and your work, indeed had a massive impact on your life as a whole. And what I'm kind of interested here specifically is about this, you know, the kind of relationship between love and trauma, or you sort of said it like earlier, this sort of need for self-love as a kind of a precondition for actually making art. You know, almost you need to get to that point. And can you talk a little bit about that kind of, you know, complex of relationships of self-love, self-hate, hate, love, trauma, the whole shebang?
Not really. That's really complex. I suggested a title for this could be Body Count. I was thinking about, Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is about his discovery of post-traumatic stress disorder. through working with Vietnamese veterans. You know, previously, you know, Second World War victims might have had, battle fatigue or something like that, you know, some euphemism for this. But it's something that affects you very physically, you know, and you respond, and everyone's different. It depends what's happened to you. So I think that because of the lack of care, and I think the lack of understanding how to love. I'm not saying there wasn't love, but how to love and how to care. As a child growing up with that, that can be quite alienating. And you can think that there's something wrong with you. You know, and you can also feel that it's your fault. I've done something wrong. What's wrong with me? And you know, you might find ways to compensate for that I think I did. One of the ways might be by trying to get attention. You know, if you attend to me, then you love me. Yeah, you're fulfilling some need. And so making art meant that I could get attention. I would be paid attention, and it wouldn't matter if someone liked it or not. It was because I was getting attention, and that's what was important. So there's the making of art. There's doing things to get attention. You know, I was always doing things to get attention, you know, whether it was dressing strangely, wearing makeup, God knows what when I was a teenager, getting into trouble, drinking, taking drugs, self-medicating, whatever. So there's a conflict going on, trying to find what it is. How can I love myself? I feel, you know, there's a lot of self-loathing. You know, there may even be a lot of guilt about something that you may not even understand. It may be completely misplaced. And you may be very confused about these things. You know, you may try to find relationships and try to find love in relationships, and maybe they break down and you don't understand why. You may be behaving in social situations in a way that other people don't understand, and you think you are being clear, or you've said something in a social situation and people have reacted, and you think, oh, I didn't mean it like that. You've misunderstood me. But you may not have any language or confidence to be able to articulate what that is, because you can't necessarily say, oh, I'm doing this because I'm looking for love, right?
There's something really interesting in difference. What I mean by that is I mean actually not that long ago, about 2 years ago, I realized that I have got ADHD, which to me was an absolute eye opener, and it was like a eureka moment, and a huge weight fell off my shoulders. I kind of began to understand that it wasn't an imagined difference that was sort of kind of separating me from others all my life. But there was a real difference, and that difference was okay because it was part of my biology, part of my chemistry. You know, it wasn't something that I had done or done wrongly, or that I was educated in the wrong way or brought up, or that something. No, I was just different, and that was just okay that way. And there was a huge relief in that. But at the same time, it made me reflect on that difference and how that difference had shaped my life. And it's interesting when you mention attention. Of course, it's one thing to be an attention seeker because you feel we're all the same and I want to have a louder voice. But it's a very different position to seek attention from a position of difference, because there it's not about attention seeking, but it's about, hang on, that's not how it is. It's really different. And so I think when you come from a sort of a neurodiverse position, I don't think it's necessarily fair to call somebody who is then seeking attention an attention seeker. Maybe it's just a difference teller. But I think there's a big difference there. And of course, when you experience difference in that profound, fundamental kind of way, you know, you often end up in situations that either cumulatively or, you know, like in one big shebang, lead to trauma. So you can end up, you often get kind of quite sort of like hybrid forms, sort of neurodiverse situations. And so I find that a really interesting, and of course in the Northern Irish context, you must have had a very strong sense of, and you've talked about this already, that sense of difference, the sort of, between you and your kind of aspirations, your kind of way of seeing the world and what you saw around yourself. Can you talk about that a little bit more? And it kind of like maybe also in relation to trauma, if that's kind of possible.
Well, what I'm describing is placing myself in the position of that younger person that I was, and not having the language of neurodiversity to understand what was taking place, or differentiate it, or diagnose it. And like yourself, this is, and that's why I bring in, Van der Kolk, because through his writing on PTSD, it's, a lot of people have realized, actually, hold on a minute, I think some of this relates to me. And I'm glad that that's popular, because more people need to understand, who've sort of felt that they were different. No one understood them, and I'm placing myself in that language of that younger person, So I understand a lot more about it now, and the complexity of my situation and the complexity of the trauma that was both familial and induced by civil conflict, but also by a form of autism. So it's a bit mixed up with lots of different elements, that neurodiversity. And so some of it is biological, some of it is environmental, and some, and that leads to, psychological states involved in that as well. And if you're carrying that through your life without any diagnosis, and trying to, in a way, trying to understand it myself through making art, through the creative outlet, and also in my history as well, through self-medication, through drugs and alcohol, then you have a kind of combustible cocktail going on, excuse the pun, with alcohol. So that, either you could reach a point where you have completely, as happened with me, where you get to the point where it could have been death or survival. And that came actually completely outside of art. Because at the point where that happened to me, art didn't exist. And that was the biggest, the largest pain that I've gone through, where I could not make art. And I completely collapsed into addiction to cope with everything that had gone on. And so then I became physically addicted to substance abuse and alcohol abuse. And then that precipitated a complete collapse. But thankfully, in my case, that complete collapse enabled me somehow to see some light. In fact, something happened where I had a revelation about, oh, hold on, you can survive this. There's enough work. And again, that was quite intuitive in a way. I wouldn't have sat down and given you reasons for that. I wouldn't have been able to diagnose that. And in fact, the diagnoses came much, much later, and many, many years. But then that's many years after spending a long time in recovery from drugs and alcohol to understand what had taken place and how I could survive that, and the mechanisms I could use to survive that on a daily basis. And then art was able to come back into my life, and in quite a different way. See, I got to the point where I thought I could never ever make art again. And that was just so painful. I was completely lost, And that was a different thing to confront as well, because then the question is, have you created this other ego that is this artist, and you've created this have you created a mythology around this to somehow support your behavior? Or can you actually confront that and find what the truth is about what you've just been doing with your life?
I mean, there's an interesting question, Andre, really about this, the true self, that kind of thing. It's like and of course there isn't such a thing as a true self, but I think it's when, I mean, I certainly had that experience that once I was able to sort of like, sort of put a kind of almost a pathology to it without actually wanting to pathologize it, but I've been able to kind of give it a name and kind of, sort of in a way describe it, and also obviously then be able to compare it and kind of engage with other people who have similar experiences. At that point, I began to realize that there was a sort of a me that I hadn't seen before, but the me that I had seen before was still a real me. Don't get me wrong, but it didn't seem to be. And there's an interesting thing about that. And of course, I mean, when you sort of say, you got to this point where making art became difficult, impossible, you just basically ended being an art, with that kind of just with that sort of a blackout and sort of a paralysis. And this is another interesting topic here. There is something, fundamental about, making art. I mean, for example, one of the things that I did realize in kind of understanding who I am also was that I couldn't have picked another life. I couldn't have picked. It wasn't just all chance and this and that. No, there was something inscribed in me. And you must know this experience. You go to a class reunion, like school reunion, or you meet people that you've been to school with, and you meet them like 20, 30, 40 years later, and you think, makes perfect sense that that person turned out that way. You couldn't have said that back then. You couldn't have said this person's going to become this, is going to do that. But looking back, it seems to make sense because we do sense things in people that somehow then accumulate into a biography. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, how do you feel about that? I mean, do you think that you could have been somebody else? Do you think that the way you were shaped by trauma and experience made it inevitable that you did what you did? Or how do you see that?
No. I don't. I'm quite happy with who I am. I'm grateful that I survived and became a better me as a result of that. Not a different me, just a better me, I hope. But it's interesting, isn't it? Craig, yeah.
When you started to kind of go back to painting in 2013, was that part of this process of coming back, or kind of, or did that happen earlier?
No, there was a period where I spent a few years in very, very intense recovery from alcohol and drug abuse, where I really wasn't doing very much artistically. I was doing, actually, the one thing I started doing was making music again and recording, and that seemed to be a way to deal with that. And then eventually went back into performance, and then so that was about, let's see, about 3 years, and then I went. I was invited to go to Poland to make a performance. I made this performance in Poland, and I actually at that time I felt very separated from the performance art scene, very much an outsider. I seemed to be by myself on my own. But I was invited to a gallery to make something in Poland, in Krakow. I made something there. Then some artists saw me who had organized some festivals, and suddenly my career took off again. And I suddenly found myself traveling all over the world for many years. It was absolutely incredible, extraordinary that it happened, and I couldn't believe it. It's like, whoa, going to Japan and all over the place. And 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 so the performance continued right through to, and it was about 2008, although my last performance was 2013. I was trying to extricate myself from performance around 2008 to 2013. And 2008, I felt that I was very, I don't want to be critical of what other artists were doing in performance, but what I was seeing was not something that I felt had a lot of discipline And it seemed to be quite, there wasn't enough depth for me. There were some artists that I really liked their work, but I found that I was on this treadmill of all these festivals and being paid well and being flown out all over the world to do things. And it sort of didn't mean anything anymore. It didn't mean very much. Not that it didn't mean anything. And I felt like I was trying too hard to come up with the next performance and the next performance. And with my practice, it was never like repeating something. It was always trying to understand the context, the situation, make something specific to that, what's going on in my work, how do I, make work to do with this situation. So it was a lot of hard work to get to that point each time. And it was very draining emotionally and spiritually and physically, um, constantly jet lagged. And it seemed to be quite lonely as well. I seemed to still, this sense that I didn't quite belong. Although I was getting this kind of strange adulation from younger artists, which I was very uncomfortable with. I find it very difficult to deal with. Um, and the interesting thing was, I just decided, right, I want to translate what's been going on into another space. I want to go back into the studio and I want to make paintings. I want to make something very physical. I want to understand where I left off with painting. Because the thing was, I was always painting and drawing and making other artworks, but I wanted a concentrated space to understand what painting was about, and in particular, oil painting. And I wanted to become technically proficient at oil painting and understanding it as a substance, as a material, as something actually quite alchemical. So I wanted to take that, and it had to do with my body, it had to do with very big paintings and translating that into painting. Now, what went on with this was I started Jungian therapy, and when at the first few sessions talking with my analyst, we were talking about where I was in my life. Now, I specifically had this analyst who had worked with other artists, right? And that was really important. And Jungian was really important because of the spiritual background with that. And my analyst was saying, right, how old are you? Where are we in your life? I said, I've just turned 50. I want you to help me with the transition from this activity in making art to this activity in making art. And she said, this is perfect and it's completely intuitive. The transition from something at 50-year-old into the other part of your life was really, really important because it started to be about a reflection on what had happened on that first part of my life. So it actually followed a Jungian life cycle into this other part. So the painting really became my spiritual space.
That also explains that statement, that work is sort of love made visible.
Well, and then it became what work becomes love made visible because it's like there's a really great John Cage quote, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I can't remember exactly, but he said, right, when I walk into the studio, I take the whole world into the studio with me, and as I'm working, I'm thinking of people, I take all my friends, all the people, as I'm working, they leave person by person, right? And if I'm really, really lucky and it's a good day, I leave. And that's the point that I want to get to. It's the point where I got to in performances, where I became very fluid in the performance and I disappeared into it. You could call it transcendent in a way, if you like. In the studio, that's what happens. It's like it's a secret space for me. It's a space where I can do what I want, and I'm not in the studio. Things happen. Two great things happen: the making of art and the making of love. That's what I experience in the studio, and it doesn't matter what's happening. Some of it might be crap. It doesn't matter. It's the activity in the process. And the unfortunate thing about doing this is And the reason probably why I started making performances, you accumulate a lot of stuff. In performance, it was like, okay, you got all your documentation, but actually, it's in boxes. Now I've got all these bloody big paintings that no one wants. You can't do anything with them. You can't get them in your house. There's only a certain amount of museums want to take stuff like that. So I've got like all this work, and I've got a warehouse full of paintings, and I seriously don't care if that warehouse went up in flames. I really don't care. And people, oh no, you can't. And periodically I destroy paintings, right? And I film it. It's another kind of like provocative performance action, right? I slash them up, and in the studio, and I film them, and I put them on Instagram, and people, dude, not destroy your paintings, So it's a bit like that, because really it's the process. That's what it's about. And really, I think that, yeah, there are paintings I have that I really enjoy and I like, and I sometimes bring them into the house and hang them on the wall because they're like old friends. And I remember the moment that they're made, and there was something, that relationship, that particular time and moment in space. And I think that's really important. But in the end, it's just stuff, and it's all going to go.
That's right. I want to, sort of to come to sort of a closing position on this dialogue. I want to go back once more, very briefly, on this idea of the life cycle, or when you transition to painting, and you talk to your analyst, to your therapist about that transition. It's interesting because even before you mentioned that, to me, it sounded a bit like sort of a homecoming. Kind of from a long journey. And although I wouldn't really say that it's sort of that a circle kind of closed, or that it was kind of like, it's more like a spiral, isn't it? It's kind of like there was sort of as you said, you call it an expanded proposition. So there's but still there's a homecoming aspect to that. So you've talked about the body as a transitional object. Of course, in education or in pedagogics, that term obviously has a definition. I'm sure, I don't know whether you actually mean it in those terms, or whether you have your own definition of what you mean by a transitional object. My sense is that you mean that the body is a transient thing rather than a kind of a static thing. But I'm sure you can elaborate on that. And what I'd like you to reflect on, sort of like before we finish this dialogue, is on the passing of time and the way your relationship to your body and to the performative aspect of your work has changed. And also a little bit about that sort of very last stage that still lies ahead, death, and I guess is sort of the final conclusion of where we all end up one day. So talking about the body as a transitional object is something that is inscribed with memory, both individual and collective. When you think about your body, your performance, how would you talk about that? How do you see that passing of time affecting your work?
Oh, how does it affect my work? Because I was thinking about that transition through life and things that we do. They only happen in those moments, and those moments are really important. They also make us who we are. But it's it gets harder to talk about. And I think that's why initially, when you were asking me for some guideline questions, I find it really hard to talk about art now. It's like I feel that, working in university and it being, it's talked about in very academic terms. And that's fine. That's a language, and it's a way of interpreting and thinking about it, and it's pedagogical and stuff like that. I think I'm starting to become really detached from that and simplifying it much more to the moment of just doing something and being more and more in the moment of just living and being each day. Um, and I think it's interesting because I've just moved house, as I said, up to the Welsh valleys, and so I'm I'm doing a lot of work on this house, and that's become the creative kind of outlet. It's a very particular kind of house, um, and I've just renovated the loft for an archive room, and a lot of my archives stored in various places, and I need to kind of get it into one place. And I was just looking through some stuff this morning, and I just think, oh, isn't that nice? That guy who did that stuff, I know him. Yeah, and but it's more about the backstory. It's not about I call it, and sometimes I'm looking. I really don't remember this photograph. I don't remember being there. You know, you know, and there's obviously things are dated because I kept records and okay. But what's fascinating for me is that I remember the things that surrounded that particular time of that event, relationships, people I was with, times when we did certain things, you know, and all those other things which are part of very ordinary life in a way, in a very extraordinary set of circumstances. And that's what fascinates me. And I love that. I love that person. I'm not sure about the work because the work exists in another time. And if you weren't there to experience it, you will never know what it's like, what it was like. All you have is the photographs and the video and the documentation, and they are not the work. They really are not the work. They are a kind of simulation of something, right? But for me, the important thing is that haunting of memory, that memory that exists that surrounds those things. And it's really lovely to have that. Even though there were bad things that happened, I still feel very sympathetic to them and very loving and kind, I think, and empathetic towards that person that I was.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, for much of my life, I felt I was kind of, in a way, making a kind of a big distinction between, the art and the artist. And this is tends to be a distinction that is made in sort of like in art criticism and you name it. So you can have a terrible artist, a terrible person, a total Nazi fascist person. Take somebody like whatever, Werner Herzog, amazing films, but the guy is a Nazi. I mean, I mean, whatever. There's tons of people. I don't think Picasso was such a super nice guy either. So we used to make, and it's very much in the interest of the market and the interest of the kind of the curatorial system to make that split, to separate the art from the artist. And it's easier, isn't it? Because we don't have to take that into account. And I found it, although I can see why art criticism and art historians would do that, and they would talk about, make that separation. I find it for myself increasingly difficult to do that. I find it increasingly, unacceptable to accept a work of art if I don't accept the artist who made it. That's just me, and and I make that same. So when I look at my own stuff over, there are times in my life when I didn't particularly, looking back, when I don't particularly like myself, the person I was back then. And I tend to kind of get into this thing where I then don't particularly like the work I did then either. And then how is that for you? Do you make that distinction between, are you happy with this idea that, André Stitt is the artist and the work is over here, and we can look at it separately from the artist, or do you feel that the two are a unit?
I've never separated it. It's all biography. I've never separated it. I'm not different from my art. I really am not. I could say like, oh, I go out and perform, and there's a slight separation in how I go about that, but they're equally me. I don't disavow or don't disown any of it. Good, bad, indifferent, ugly, it doesn't matter to me. I'm the full thing. And I refuse to do that. And if someone doesn't like it, that's not my problem. They have to look at why they don't like it in the same way that I don't like certain things. I go away and think about it, look at what's being mirrored in the work that I have to think about. But no, for me, it's a bit like making the work, and it's a bit like making any work. It's phenomenological. it's embodied. Um, it's also, well, it's also kind of atemporal because it's everything. It's all happening at once. It's like, I don't, we're talking about looking back, but I don't think of it. It's like it's all here, and bits of it come out when we're having different conversations, It's all me, you know.
And of
I
course,
want,
it's much easier. It's much easier to maintain that unity in performance because there it really is your body, So it really is.
sure,
But with
sure.
painting, that'll end up stored in some kind of or hangs in some gallery wall, and and that separation sometimes becomes quite absolute. But of course, you don't make that distinction. I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, I think you probably also think of painting as an extension of performance or part of a performative thing. So it's not just painting, I take it.
No, it's everything. It's an art practice. It's a way of life. I've always felt like that. It's like art life, no difference. It's always been there with me. I don't know why, it's since childhood, it was always there. When I was a young, like 1.5, 2 year old, like scribbling and drawing, it was always there. The only thing that it's like what I'm made for. I came to make art and that's it. And I can't do anything else. Really, that's what I'm here for. And that's not like egotistic. It's just that's what I do. It's like hardwired into me. And even if I separated myself from the public in some way, I'd still be making it in private. There'd still be something going on. There's always some creative endeavor going on with me. I cannot help myself.
Okay, so I think that is a very, very good point to kind of to finish. Just one last question. What are you reading at the moment? Is there any books or any kind of thing that you would recommend to our listeners or viewers?
I'm reading Rainbow Man. It's David Bowie from the 1960s through to yeah, probably Scary Monsters 1980. But it's really great because what you get is a real insight. It's not about any of his affairs, what he did in his personal life. It's talking album by album. It's talking about the people who were around him, friends, people who worked with him, studio people. And it's a remarkable insight into how amazing he was as a person dealing with people, making music, but also how amazing he was musically. It's really, really quite incredible insight. Apart from that, I'm reading, it's right here, Nostalgia. It's by Agnes Arnold Foster. Kind of interesting. Not brilliant, but really some good insights. I was reading Patricia McCormick's A Human Manifesto, which is really interesting about the cessation of all human life, which is an interesting manifesto for saving the planet. Yeah, get rid of the humans.
It's a dark book, isn't it?
It is, but I find it strangely. I find it actually quite positive in lots of ways. I find it really fascinating. There's a lot that I agree with in relation to it.
When you found yourself in a situation where you couldn't make art during that really difficult time in your life, was that a kind of a human period in your life?
Craigie. Oh, good God. That's hard to think back on. It was so dark. It was so painful. It was so bad, so dark. Um, I don't think in term. I just can't remember. I wouldn't say it was a human. It might have come close, but it's a strange thing when you think back to something like that. That it was so painful, and the drugs and alcohol didn't work to stop the pain, and I wanted to die, yet something wouldn't allow me to die. I mean, there's something about the resilience of human beings which I find fascinating, and their capacity for love and empathy and wonder is amazing, but also their capacity for conflict, death, killing, war is just unfathomable. And I cannot reconcile what that is. It's very painful. The human race is very painful. Um, but yeah, I'm glad I survived. That's all I can say.
So am I. So am I. And I'm really, really happy, and I feel very privileged that you took all this time to talk to me today. This has been an amazing dialogue, and I'm sure some people have seen it already, but it'll stay up, and it'll also go out as a podcast, as an audio podcast, across all the usual platforms. Andre, I
But
really think.
before we go, thank you too, and thank you for being very patient. It's often difficult for me, I think, these days to make decisions to do things because I'm so preoccupied with lots of things happening in and around me, and that I just find it very difficult to understand how I can answer anything because of where I am in my life. It seems that I don't. I find it very difficult to have a dialogue about this stuff. And yet, when we start talking, then we make the connection and then it starts to happen. And sometimes I'm maybe a bit skeptical about that. So I have to get rid of my own cynicism in these things, and my own sense of vulnerability, I think. Because actually, I think vulnerability is an asset.
Well, do you know when you talked about the way you approach painting in another talk you gave, you talked about it as starting with a blank canvas and not knowing where that takes you. And in a way, this dialogue was a bit like that. And I think it takes the same courage to engage in this kind of dialogue as it does to do a painting. And I'm very grateful that you extended that trust and confidence in me. So thank you very, very much. And I hope other people will treasure it as much as I have done.
Thank you, Nico.
Have a good day, and we'll stay in touch.